Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. As Afghanistan prepares for a presidential election, many in the political and media mainstream speak of the country's first democratic transition. This may or may not be true. What is less talked about is the dire security situation on the ground, whether Karzai is angling to succeed himself, the powerful presence of the Taliban, and whether the U.S. will ever actually leave Afghanistan. To cross-check the upcoming election in Afghanistan, I'm joined by John Glaser in Washington. He is a contributing editor at antiwar.com and a columnist for the Washington Times community section. Also in Washington, we have Michael Kugelman. He is an associate at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And in Philadelphia, we cross to Dinh. He is a political commentator and a writer. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. John, the reason, if I can go to you first in Washington, well, the reason why I wanted to do this program is, number one, always make the American people and Western publics remember what we did in Afghanistan. That's always a top priority for me. Number two, looking at the headlines, democratic transition. This is the first democratic transition in Afghanistan. I'll give my opinion about that later. But don't you think that that's the wrong focus here, is that actually nothing very good has happened in Afghanistan in the last 12 years, and that's something Western media and political elites don't like to talk about anymore?
Well, there's really no actual practicing democracy to speak of in Afghanistan. What you have is a kleptocratic, corrupt state that has control over some of the country and doesn't have the ability to maintain security over even the parts that it supposedly controls. We have the state about 80% of the government's budget comes from abroad in foreign aid, so it can't sustain itself. And, you know, in terms of who will succeed Karzai, if it will be democratic, you know, that remains to be seen. I know that there will be some international observations of how the elections go, but previous elections have proven to be fraudulent, and many of the people running include warlords and insurgents and, you know, people that welcomed the Al-Qaeda people in back in the 90s. So, you know, it's hard really to talk about any functioning democracy in Afghanistan. And, you know, the United States has a lot of culpability for that.
Okay, Michael, I mean, talking about a transition in Afghanistan is a way for the United States to finally cut and run. They won't do it, obviously, using those terms, but they're still going to stay there. And isn't that really what the future of Afghanistan is about, is the kind of relationship, military relationship the United States and Afghanistan will have moving forward? It has very little to do with the election, actually.
Well, I actually wouldn't go that far. I don't think it's a sure thing that the United States is going to stay in Afghanistan. Literally, it will. There's going to be a development presence and a diplomatic presence for a number of years.
Yeah, but they're negotiating for nine bases, though, Michael. They want 9 bases for quote-unquote training purposes.
Right, they are. But those negotiations have been suspended, and there's increasing. I'm hearing things around town that this so-called zero option, in other words, an entire military withdrawal from Afghanistan, may not be out of the question, just because it's been so hard for the White House to work with Hamid Karzai. It's become a very tortured relationship. I agree with you. Certainly the U.S. government would want to maintain a residual force in Afghanistan, and that probably will end up happening. But, you know, I don't think we want to get ahead of ourselves. There may not be a residual presence in Afghanistan, and quite frankly, this election, this democratic transition, may be delayed. There may well not even be elections next year. You know, a number of Afghan politicians, powerful politicians close to Karzai, have said they're very uneasy about the idea of having an election, given the security situation and given the fact that the U.S. is withdrawing. And there's also indications that some of these politicians, again, close to Karzai, would not be happy with any of the presidential candidates. There are about 27 of them right now. So it's really a very uncertain, unclear situation right now.
Okay, Lynn, how do you read the tea leaves here? Because the U.S. certainly would like to maintain some kind of military presence there for purposes that could be explained within Afghanistan, outside of Afghanistan. Iran comes to mind, things like this here. But this seems like this is not even an amicable divorce between the United States and Afghanistan, particularly when we look at Mr. Karzai.
Well, we have to look more closely at why the U.S. is there in the first place, and that's for geopolitical reasons. Is to keep a check on Iran and to maintain a footprint in Central Asia. So with that in mind, the U.S. would definitely like to stay on beyond 2014. The reason why it's scaling back his involvement is because he's reached a kind of stalemate in his war with the Taliban. It cannot defeat the Taliban with 100,000 troops, so it will not be able to control the Taliban with 10 or 20,000 troops. And Karzai will be irrelevant soon enough because he's stepping down anyway, and the administration will collapse and his army will collapse. So the U.S. is pulling back because it's going broke at home, and his army is exhausted from fighting the Taliban, which it can't defeat. And the election itself will be illegitimate because the Taliban, which is the strongest force in Afghanistan, will not participate. It will even try to sabotage it. So my prediction for the future is that the Taliban will have a stronger presence after the U.S. scale back its presence there.
You know, John, reading antiwar.com is the first thing I do in the morning after having some coffee, and I read a fascinating article on that website, how Karzai is just going to succeed himself. He's angling to do that. He's just going to move next door and keep an eye on the new president, whoever that may be.
Yeah, this is an indication of how corrupt the Afghan government is. That, you know, he's looking to have someone that's already within his inner circle come after him, and he'll be sort of like a Dick Cheney to our George W. Bush, really pulling the strings and behind things. So, you know, things don't look particularly good. You know, what's funny is that there's a lot of predictions about what will happen in Afghanistan and a lot of differing opinion about exactly what will occur. But there's only one major divide. And the major divide goes like this. About 99% of observers, by my count, think it's going to hell in a handbasket. And then the 1% is in the Obama administration and supportive elements in the Congress, which say everything's going swimmingly, it's all peachy, we're successfully training the Afghan security forces, and it's peaceful, and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of propaganda we've been hearing for the past 12 years. It's always going wonderfully. It was always going wonderfully in Iraq. And so, you know, that divide needs to really end, because I think the American people really see what a failure and a waste this whole Afghan war has been.
You know, Michael, what happens if, I agree with you, we didn't even know if there's going to be an election, and the legitimacy of Karzai within Afghanistan is questionable among Afghans outside of Kabul. I was there last year. It's only about security. I mean, security is the only thing that you think about when you're in Kabul. I can't imagine what it's like outside of Kabul. You know, with no security, how can there be any kind of political progress?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, security has to come first. And certainly, I think it's important to acknowledge that the situation has improved on the ground, modestly so, over the last few years, certainly. I mean, Kabul is a city that's functional. You know, people can move around relatively freely in certain parts of the city. It's not chaotic, et cetera, like that. But certainly, once you leave Kabul, which essentially is Hamid Karzai's personal fiefdom, once you leave Kabul, it gets really bad, particularly in the south and the east, near Pakistan, and increasingly even in the northern parts of the country, which we had been told were the more peaceful, relatively more stable parts of the country. So I'm very skeptical if there is an election, how credible it'll be.
Go ahead, John, jump in.
Yeah, you know, what's funny is that the level of violence in Afghanistan now is about what it was prior to the Obama administration's surge in 2009 and 2010. And the levels of violence overall in the country went up as the U.S. efforts to stabilize the country and make it secure went up. And so this is an indication of what a failure U.S. policy has been and what a failure counterterrorism policy has been. The places that are still unstable are unstable because the insurgency is alive and well, and as Linh said, we can't defeat it. And yet, the Obama administration seems to be biding its time for a way to get out and say, look how we won. You know, it's just like in Vietnam. Nixon and Kissinger were desperate to get out and be able to wave a flag of victory, when everyone that just has eyes and isn't so cynical can see the truth, and that's that we failed.
Linh, you wanted to jump in there in Philadelphia. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that the United States is painting itself as the source of security and the source of as a solution, but it is actually the instigator of violence and chaos in Afghanistan. So, we should reframe the question. So, as long as it just stays there, there will be violence, there will be chaos, because it's an occupying power. It has turned Afghanistan into this very corrupt and narco state. Heroin production is out of control there. So it is a source of all the chaos and all the violence, and it will remain that way as long as U.S. maintains even a minimal presence in Afghanistan.
Mike, how do you feel about that? Because, I mean, again, the U.S. wants to keep a footprint there, but the longer its footprint is there, the more, well, what Linh had to say, the violence will continue because of occupation.
Well, I wouldn't say that the U.S. forces and international forces are the only reason that there's violence, and not that it's the only spark for violence in Afghanistan. Certainly there are a number of other factors, one of them being the fact that Pakistan has become a sanctuary for many of the militant groups, the Afghan Taliban, the Haqqani network, that go on the offensive in Afghanistan. And also, just the fact that the Afghan government has not yet been able to convince the Afghan people that it provides a better alternative to the Taliban, that keeps recruitment levels up.
That's a very good point, gentlemen. We're going to go to a short break here, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Afghanistan. Stay with RT. Okay, John, I'd like to go back to you in Washington. Michael brought up a really good point here. What about the 800-pound gorilla called the Taliban? What do they want? Okay, everyone looks at Karzai, these, comic book candidates running for president. Most of them are cronies of Karzai anyway. But what about the Taliban? They're the ones that are making decisions on the ground.
Yeah, there are many areas in Afghanistan, particularly in the southeast, where the Taliban hold ultimate control. They collect taxes, they have laws, and they adjudicate disputes between people. This even though it's terrible and brutal, and nothing that I would ever want to accept. A lot of the people in Afghanistan say, "Hey, this at least when I'm given two unhappy plates of food, I still choose the less disgusting one," and that seems to be the Taliban, because what you have on the Afghan government side is a government that nobody trusts and nobody has any confidence in unless they're directly tied to it in some sort of financial way, which is, by the way, a lot of the reason that people sign up for the security forces. Unfortunately, in the security forces, there's a desertion rate of about 50,000 per year. But yes, people don't have confidence in the Afghan government, and what also adds to Taliban recruitment is the fact that the United States keeps killing people. I mean, it was just this week that the U.S. launched another airstrike that killed several people, including 3 children. I mean, this happens sort of every once in a while, and you have to think about the lives that tears apart. And it's no wonder suddenly that the people aren't on the side of the occupation. One other thing that Michael mentioned that's really important is that, and I have to sort of disagree with Linh here, is that although the U.S. is the greatest purveyor of violence, and a lot of the violence that occurs in Afghanistan does come from the U.S. occupation, it's also true that if we pull out, there's a strong possibility that civil war will take place. Yeah. And if that happens, of course, you can probably look at the dissolution and collapse of the Afghan state. And then the saga of the tragedy of Afghanistan, what we've done to that country since the 80s and through the 90s and up till today, is going to go on and on.
Michael, would you like to reply to that? Because it looks like it's a no-win situation. You stay, you lose. You leave, you lose.
Yeah, I think the United States has found itself really in a lose-lose position. I would argue that when this war first started in 2001, the U.S. government had what seemed to be very specific, basic goals, and that was to overthrow the Taliban and then remove the sanctuary for al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Both of those goals were essentially fulfilled several years back, but the situation has just become so ugly. This is why the United States is very good at starting wars wars, but it's not very good at ending them. That's true across the board. So now you have a situation where the Taliban is not in power officially, but it could very well threaten to return to power. And Al-Qaeda, of course, I mean, Afghanistan is no longer a sanctuary, but you have Al-Qaeda havens in the tribal areas of Pakistan, and of course, Al-Qaeda has changed a lot as an organization in recent years, but it's shifted to other parts of the world,
in
to
Pakistan
the Middle East and
are only
North
a threat
Africa,
to the
where there could be more
U.S. in that
problems.
they can do cross-border attacks.
Go ahead, John, continue.
I was just
Right. Well,
yeah, I was just going to say that this idea that there's a sanctuary in Pakistan, there's no longer a sanctuary for terrorists in Afghanistan, and the one in Pakistan, I mean, yeah, it's the only way that it threatens the United States is that they can do cross-border attacks on occupying forces in Afghanistan. There's really no threat to the homeland
US is attacking
that requires a.
Go ahead, Lynn, jump in. Go ahead in Philadelphia. Lynn, jump in.
I'm just saying that U.S. is attacking Pakistan because the Pashtuns are also in Pakistan. The Pashtuns live on both sides of the borders, and they've been there for 2,000 years. So, a war against the Taliban is basically a war against the Pashtuns, and they make up nearly 50% of Afghanistan's population. So you can't kill them all. So, they will remain there till the end. They will win out in the end.
Michael, go ahead.
It's a very complicated. I mean, the tribal areas of Pakistan. It's true that one has to look at the ethnic issues, at the Pashtun issues. But let's face it. I mean, that's become a haven for militants that are from all over the world. In Central Asia, you have Punjabi militants from Pakistan that have moved up there. It's really it's a cauldron, unfortunately, of militancy. That I think it's important to look at it in a broad way. It's not just the Taliban, and it's not just a Pashtun issue. It goes much deeper than that, in my view.
Okay, but John, I mean, I agree with Michael
the
here.
US
Why is the U.S. Let me go to
problem.
John. What is the U.S. doing there? In light of what we just heard from Michael here, wouldn't it be better if the U.S. is completely withdrew? You're right. It could be a civil war, but it's going to be the folks on the ground that are going to decide the outcome, because the U.S. and its allies can't determine any outcome that it wants.
Yes, and this should be clear to us after 13 years now of fumbling around and screwing things up. The United States presence there can only do worse for the country of Afghanistan. We will continue to push militants into the sanctuaries in Pakistan. We need to get out, and get out yesterday in complete and total, I mean, a full withdrawal, not a semi-withdrawal with 10,000 troops plus JSOC and bases for drones. We are not going to improve the situation through the militarism that has been the case over more than a decade now. I hate to bring up the cliched phrase of trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But that's true psychosis.
Michael, Karzai has talked about negotiating with the Taliban, and this is kind of an interesting scenario because he's out of favor with Washington. I mean, Washington still has to give that government money, okay, and good for Karzai and his cronies. But I mean, if you're making a deal with the Taliban, you're kind of playing both sides against the middle here. This is what's going to keep Karzai and his clan in power. I don't care if he's president or not president; that doesn't make any difference. But this is an interesting scenario that he may be attempting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fundamental divide here when it comes to the issue of negotiating with the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban has been very insistent that it wants the United States to be involved, that it would negotiate with the United States because the United States is the occupying power. It does not want Kabul does not want the Afghan government involved, but of course, Karzai understandably wants this to be a quote-unquote Afghan-led process, and that's a divide that has not been bridged yet. And quite frankly, if that's not divided, if that's not bridged, then you have to link this to the future of the U.S. military in Afghanistan, because Karzai has said that unless there's a peace process led by the Afghan government, he's not going to negotiate a security agreement to allow the U.S. To stay there after 2014. So this is something that people around here in Washington in my view, don't really make that link enough, because there's a pretty good chance that we may not have much of a presence, military presence, in that country by the end of next year. Okay,
Lynn, maybe after 12 years, that's not a bad thing to happen.
Well, the war on terrorism has been incoherent from the start. It's now being presented as a war against Islamic fundamentalists and against terrorists, but the United States is supporting fundamentalists in Syria and Libya. So you know, it doesn't make any sense that we are fighting the Taliban because they're fundamentalists, but since we are already supporting terrorists and fundamentalists elsewhere.
John, how much does it get down to just hubris? John, how much does it get down to hubris that this has been a complete, utter waste of time? No. I mean,
look,
you can't...
I think in the beginning, the Afghan war was a lot about hubris. Right now, I think it's about political reputation. Okay. I think it's about not wanting to admit to the world, and everything the United States does is apparently has to be on the world stage, but to admit to the world that we screwed things up and failed, and failed miserably. It'll be harder for us to do the nationalistic, ceremonial praising of the sacrifices of our soldiers who have died in vain, and who have been maimed and had their lives ripped apart themselves, in addition to the Afghan people, for the political reputations of the people in the executive branch. You know, it's interesting to note that back when the Obama administration was deciding on whether or not to surge in Afghanistan, there are some insiders that have written in publications like Foreign Policy magazine who have noted that Obama was planning on withdrawing fully, or at least almost fully, from Iraq. And in order not to be criticized by the military, and in order to seem like still he was a tough guy and a strong leader, he decided to do the surge in Afghanistan. This has always been about politics for the Obama administration. And that's a sad note that people continue to die on the ground. The country continues to be torn to shreds. The corrupt government in Afghanistan is being enriched again just for the political reputation of Barack Obama. It needs to stop.
Michael, what about that? Is it just about reputation? Because, I mean, just getting all of the stuff out of Afghanistan is costing billions and billions of dollars. Linh just pointed out, what about making money? Well, I mean, of course, the defense companies are very happy with this because they have to replace the stuff. I mean, it's a win-win for them.
Yeah, I mean, it really has become an issue of credibility because Obama essentially took ownership of this war. I mean, he was elected, he said he was going to withdraw from Iraq and get things right with Afghanistan. And so that's why he ended up committing to the surge. And now I think what John says is to an extent I would agree with. I think that Obama has always been someone he's never been comfortable committing to a long-term military presence. He's always sparred with the generals about troop numbers. And then even when he announced the surge, he said right then that he was going to pull them out within 18 months. But at the same time, he took ownership over this war. So I think there's this intent in the White House to try to do something, anything, whatever that is, I don't know, to try to make this more of a quote-unquote honorable withdrawal. But there's really nothing very honorable about it right now. And I think the key is, as someone said before, let's try to figure out how to get out as quickly as possible, in as smooth a fashion as possible. But it's not going to be easy.
Gentlemen, I don't think that's possible, and we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington and in Philadelphia. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. I love you.